and welcome to day 3 of our Data Champions Online Europe event. My name's Catherine and I'm one of the producers here at Crinium, and it has been my wonderful job to be hosting this event all week long. Hello to those of you tuning in for the very first time today, and welcome back to those of you who have joined us for the previous sessions. It's been a great week so far, and today's going to be no different. But before we dive into that content, just a quick message on housekeeping. Throughout the entire event, you've had the chance to submit your questions live to our speakers, and today's going to be no different. But please do be sure to get them in nice and early so our speakers have the chance to answer them live on air. You'll see where to do this in the Q&A module below. Now, should you experience any technical issues, firstly, refresh your browser and try and re-log in. If that hasn't done the trick, pop a message into the Q&A module to my team and we'll do our best to help you out. You'll also see on your screen you have some downloadable content. Do be sure to download this and dive in later on, especially the global events calendar we've got there. Now, usually I get to do these opening remarks on stage in front of all of your lovely smiley faces, but we don't have the opportunity to do that right now. So what I'd love for you to do is grab your phone and take a selfie or take a picture of your screen of you engaging in this event. Pop it up on LinkedIn using the hashtag #DataChampionsOnline. This is such a simple and easy way for you to connect with your fellow senior data champions. But also, if that wasn't enough, you'll be automatically entered into a draw to win a pair of AirPods. So you absolutely have to go on and do that. Now, to introduce you to our first 2 speakers of today, we are joined by the lovely Conrad Trang, who's the Senior Director of Marketing, and Paul Billington, who's the VP of Field Sales and Operations, Unifying Data Management from Tibco. And they're going to be walking us through an awesome session all about the art of unified data management. So without further ado, over to you both.
Thank you. So my name is Conrad Trang, and I'm here with Paul, and we're going to talk to you about the art of unified data management. So let's get started. We have a disclaimer. So when we talk to our customers and when we talk to our prospects, people talk about data being the transformative energy of the modern enterprise, and we believe that. But one of the questions that we always ask is, where does this factor into strategic priorities? And being the transformative energy of the enterprise, we often see that data becomes one of the major strategic priorities, and this is research that was done by MIT Technology Review, and you can see that in 2019 and in 2020, data is one of those top things. Last year it was really about data architecture, building that foundation, and then maybe this year it's more about providing the data to analytics and AI teams. And this particular strategic priority, it also shows up when O'Reilly does research. And O'Reilly did some research, and they found that definitely, having a documented data strategy is something all of their recipients say that they have. But when they look at where these organizations are in their journey to creating data, treating data as an asset or forging a data culture, a lot of firms aren't quite there yet. And I think that brings us to our first poll question. And Paul, do you want to take it away? Okay. So I guess I'll read the poll question.
No, sorry, technical issue on my end. Technical issue on my end. I do apologise. Yeah, here we're just trying to ascertain the audience where they're at in their own data journey. So if you can be as honest and as truthful as you can, that would be appreciated. There's no feedback loop on this, so we're not going to come and hound you down, but it's for the rest of the audience to understand where everyone is in their own data journey. So looking forward to your responses on this.
Yeah, I think the question is, is the data that we're seeing from people like O'Reilly and MIT, are they similar, right? Do people have typically some kind of strategy, but, they're somewhat, on their path or haven't yet started on that path? So, Paul, do you think we should go ahead and just pull the results? Or
I'm hoping that Catherine can see how the results are being polled. There we go.
So, I think the results, the results are broadly similar to what O'Reilly found, which is that a lot of firms have a strategy and they're executing. And most of actually 95% do not have a fully data-driven culture, or they're still on that way. So we think that what we're seeing in the market is very true. People want to treat data as an asset. They want to forge that data culture. They have a plan for doing that, but they're still trying to figure things out, still trying to get there. When we look at organizations that have actually done a very good job at this, and it's going back to that MIT report, what the consistent thing that I see, and maybe Paul, you see this too, is this concept of one place, having one place to go for information. And when I go back and I look at, I'm kind of an old soul, been doing some EDW stuff for a long time. When I go back and I look at what we did in the 80s and the 90s, mostly the 90s and 2000s probably for me, working-wise, what did people do with data warehousing? Well, a lot of people started with that one data warehouse, and then they put reporting onto that. And that was originally the one place that we went, especially when we're talking about analytics. But if you look at today we have many, 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 many one places. I think, Paul, you and I have worked with customers that have enterprise data warehouses, that have legacy applications, that have new cloud systems, that have new data lakes, that have packaged applications, data sources, data services. They're all trying to pull from to feed a vast and growing number of different consumers. And those could be everything from traditional reporting tools to new BI systems to AI, data science teams, producing things like 360 reviews. So one of the things that happens when you have this diversity, remember back in the old EDW days, it was pretty much one system. We had this conform dimensions. We had a standardized data model. But today there's a lot of other different challenges that popped up. And one of the big ones that we see is this findability question, like where is everything? And then if I do find it, what the heck does it mean? And then you have other issues around consistency. So things like, are the governance terms, let's say, is the way that SAP, my ERP system, and the way that and Salesforce, which is my CRM system, do they define customer in the same way? Actually, clearly they don't, right? When I have my consolidation system at headquarters, and I look at the consolidation down at the divisional level, or maybe at the SBU level, do they have the same hierarchies? Often they don't. They're broadly consistent. But those are some of those challenges. You've got definitional challenges, you've got data value challenges, hierarchy challenges, attribute challenges. So one of the things that we think about is how do we address that? And before we get to that, we have another poll question, and it's really trying to find out what is your organization's top data struggle? Paul, do you want to talk about this at all? Or?
Yeah, so we see a very broad range of our customers have degrees of data struggles. It could be specific to any business unit or more broadly across the organization. So here we're trying to ascertain the audience on where they're at with regards to their priorities in data struggles. Many sources could be one, of course, the consumers are taking too long in their requests. The definitions are often a cause of concern because understanding your data and having a common language is often raised as an issue with an organization. So here we're just trying to ascertain the top priorities of the audience.
So I'll give that a few seconds. And actually, one of the things that we chose not to do is we chose not to put all of the above because we talked to a lot of people and say, which is the top priority? They're all top priorities, or they're all tough challenges. Okay, well, I guess we'll move on and see what we came back with. And look at that. Actually, it is almost like all of the above because we almost have equal weighting across all of the responses here. So when I look at this survey data, I don't know what you see, Paul, but the problem around many definitions, it's your classic data governance problem, and it's often like the root of a lot of the issues that we see. People having challenges figuring out if the definition that consumer banking is using for customers is the same as commercial banking. Clearly not. The many sources findability issue, that's a pretty big one. I mean, any other comments before we move on, Paul, that you see on here?
Well, they quite often intrinsically linked. As you start to delve into definitions and the metadata, both business and technical, you get to grips to understand, where this data lives in an organization's application landscape is many and varied, and they tend to be the sources of where the confusion exists, duplication, and obviously remediation is repeated across all of those. So costs go through the roof. So they are intrinsically linked. We see that, but people have to prioritize where they're going to spend their time. And the metadata one seems to be a high priority for most of our customers, along with the data content. But it seems pretty even in this survey.
Yeah, I think it's all connected, I think, is a very good way of talking about it. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. So one of the things that I've seen out there in terms of how do we address some of the complexity that we face, we spoke to folks over at IDC, and they wrote a report recently, and they talked about this concept of using patterns, design patterns. So, Paul and I could certainly hold forth for the next 20 minutes and talk about, these conceptual issues. If you get down to brass tacks and you think about, well, let's take that complex problem. Let's try to figure out how do we extract some value. So IDC produced a couple patterns. You can download the report from us if you wish. And one of the patterns that Stuart Bond talked about is this 360 for anything. And so what is that 360 for anything? It's this concept of pulling together all of the details around the definitions, around the master data, the reference data, the metadata, pulling together all that information along with the underlying transactional system or the data services information to build these 360 views, which can be used by downstream consumers to produce reports or produce research or do some analysis. The value of this, I think it's fairly obvious, but if we look at specific domains or specific kinds of 360 views, it becomes much more apparent. So if you think about Customer 360, this is clearly something that's useful for sales, for service, for customer care, where we're trying to understand how is that customer interacting with us. And that could be everything from looking at transactions they've done, looking at clickstream information, if you're talking about streaming data. That's really trying to understand that customer in a more appropriate way, understand how to treat them or understand what they're doing. Location 360, it's going to be different depending on the kinds of location you're mastering. I mean, we have some customers who are doing well master and well 360, so that's really about oil wells or gas wells in the ground, very technical information. Projects or project site 360 is much more about the location, maybe where the sink is stored. In this case, the location 360 we're talking about is really trying to understand that physical location, the assets are on site there, the staffing, perhaps not right now with everyone in quarantine, but the staffing levels, the mix, et cetera. And then lastly, Supplier 360, very common when we're trying to do things like understand spend management. So 360, I think, is one of those ideas and one of those things that we see often, which is an idea of how to capture some value from this data. So I think one time, or some of the things that we often see is organizations want to understand how to improve their data architecture, and trying to sell improvements to data architecture infrastructure to the business is tough because it's a little bit trying to sell plumbing or selling roadways. And the idea of using something like 360, which is a pattern not only to resolve some complexity, but also to explain to the business why this is value, is inherently useful. Now, we could talk more about things like how or, why or what are the problems with 360s or what are some of the things we could do. But rather than do that, I think what I'd like to do is actually walk through an example of how to build a 360. So I'm going to skip over some of the other slides. So if we look at an example, and let's imagine that we're all part of some bank, and we're seeing the oncoming recession, or what we suspect will be a recession. We're seeing the bad economic data. So what the business wants to do is they want to understand what is our risk by sector, what is our risk by country, what is our risk by ultimate parent. So that's what they want to do. That's the business thing. Down here at the bottom, we have our resources in the organization, and they need to basically put together that infrastructure or put together that plan to go grab that data to supply all these individuals. So if we're thinking about this from IDC's pattern, and we're thinking about this from more of this practical example, what does that look like? So if we start with kind of the simple stuff, right, one thing we might want to do, so if we're trying to understand all the counterparties that we're doing business with, is simply use the master data management capabilities we have, or maybe acquire them, to build consolidated records for all that information, or pull together info from our different applications. So maybe we have a Bloomberg application with some risk information, some trading platforms, which is maybe in the UK, other systems that we want to pull together, but to really consolidate the records about those counterparties, and then what does that look like? It looks a little bit like this, and so we'll have more or less information coming from these different source systems plugged together into one golden record. But then on top of that, we might want to also start to think about all of the features or attributes or facets or hierarchies that we want to add onto that counterparty record. So if you remember, what are those three things that the team wants to do? They want to worry about the country risk, the sector risk, and then also the ultimate parent or legal entity hierarchy risk, right? So what's the risk to the group that we have rather than risk to the individual company? So those features or those attributes or those hierarchies can be seen as part of that master data management process, part of that consolidation process, adding all those things there rather than having to do it on the back end when I start to do some of my analysis. So that's that first step. What's that second step? Well, we have to literally go out and integrate the data. And there's a myriad of ways we can integrate that data. So we could pull the data from those systems individually and then basically use something like extract, transform, and load software, ETL software, shove that into our EDW. That's certainly what we've done for decades. We could be using more ELT software, putting that into a data lake, and then pulling it out and putting it into a database and then serving it up to the downstream BI systems. Or we could use virtualization. It doesn't really matter what you have to do, but one of the ideas here is that you have to use some kind of data integration software. So whether you choose to use physical moves or you choose to use virtualization, so you do have to go grab that transactional data. So this is really the exposure information. But once I have those two sets of data together, the team that's working on those golden records, the team that's working on that transactional data, they have to use that master data as the pivot point. How do we align the information that we have? And once that's done, we end up with these 360 endpoints, and that 360 endpoint is served up to the individuals that work inside the organization that produce the dashboards. So those individuals will then have that point, they have the attributes, they have the hierarchies, and we end up with these different views of the same data that satisfy our business users. So maybe the individuals are looking more at that sector type view. They have, if you're looking on the screen here, they have all the data elements. They've got the master and reference data, which is really the dimensions and hierarchies. Those are living over here. You see the attributes down here being treated as essentially the x-axis in our chart. And then the exposures that we're pulling from those applications, that's really coming, or the facts, you could say, that's coming through the data integration layer. It's being blended with that master data, and it's appearing on these charts. And then over here, you see more of that legal entity hierarchy view. Over here, you see more of that, say, country-level view. One of the things that we want to stress is that the architecture is providing that backplane upon which we're going to transmit all this information. And then the endpoint that we're using is going to be common to all of the individuals that want to process information or exposures by counterparty. So one of the things that we've seen a lot in organizations is that they kind of take it from the dashboard towards the data rather than the data towards the dashboards. So they're working it from the top down rather than the bottom up. So what happens in that case? Well, if we'd taken a different approach and started with a team that's going to do our sector analysis, a different team that's going to do our enterprise analysis, a different team that's going to do our country-level analysis, when you do it that way, often what happens is those teams all end up seeking the data independently. They all tend to pull information from different sources. They might use different definitions. They might use different transformations. And then the resulting dashboards, while they're going to be broadly correct, so we're all going to say, yes, we're going to see possibly future losses in the OECD countries, or yes, we should expect to see future losses in things like travel, retail, lodging. Okay, so they're going to be broadly in line from a big picture perspective. But when we get down to that next level of detail, we might see a lot of differences that the different teams will have to reconcile out after they produce their reports or after they produce their analysis, because they're all using slightly different bits of data. I think our goal really with this type of architecture is to make sure that this endpoint is consistent for all consumers. And even better, when you look at this, let's say that we've got our team that's managing the information by sector, the team that's managing the data by legal entity, the team that's managing the information by country. Let's say we want to add another kind of analysis. Let's say country size, or let's say company size, or let's say credit rating. What if we wanted to add those features? Well, that's simply going back and adding that information to the dimension and hierarchy management system. So instead of grafting that information on the back end of one of those dashboards, we can go back to our single system. or a single place, we can add those features here, and those features are forward propagated towards the dashboard so we can create brand new dashboards. So you have this much more streamlined process to gain value or to monetize that data. So I think the big question here is that all? Is that the only thing we have to worry about? And unfortunately, the answer is no. We do have to worry about governance because we're not dealing with some type of R&D project the data scientists are cooking up in the back end. This is really something where we're going to try to productionalize or operationalize this process of monetization of the data or process of gaining value from that data. So what does that mean? From the governance perspective, what that means is there are multiple bits of governance that we need to worry about, we need to be concerned with. I mean, there's the simple things, or perhaps not so simple, but there is the front end of the piece, which is much more about the physical nature of the data, or how do we define this from a data dictionary perspective? Where is this information cited? Who has access to those systems? When I do pull the information, what is the lineage? What does it look like in terms of horizontal lineage, or how do the systems interact with each other? So there's that part of the question. There's the big data definition question, which is when I talk about counterparty in my Bloomberg system and I talk about trading partner in my trading partner system, are they the same? Are they different? Is trading partner a subset of counterparty? Do we include other types of organizations in counterparty from the high level? For this particular set of analysis, are we going to scope down counterparty? Those are all business governance, data governance, data definition type questions. If you move forward onwards, you have questions around entitlements, around finding the information. Do the teams who are pulling the information around, let's say, legal entity hierarchy or legal entity risk, are those teams entitled to the information, or do they need to go through a separate process to go demand that data from the system? And then when they do receive the data provision, how long do they have this for? Is it for a year? Is it for 2 years? I think one of the things that's come out with regulations such as GDPR, and that's really more natural person information, but one of the ideas is people have a right to use for a certain period of time. You can't use this in perpetuity anymore. You can't keep the data in perpetuity, especially around people anymore. So that's just some of the things that are baked into that level of governance. And then the last bit is really something that emerged after the great global financial crisis, but it's also now been downwards propagated into multiple other industries, which is this concept of model governance. So are the models I'm working on, are they fit for purpose? Are they still fit for purpose as time goes on? Model drifts, or the fact that the underlying assumptions, the underlying information, and in some cases, the analytics that you're using to drive your business changes the business, changes the data, which then makes your model out of date. That's a very real problem. And so if there's no governance process around understanding the models, understanding where the models are going, understanding how the models are maybe altering the underlying data, and that is going to cause this backward cascade of other updates in terms of data definitions, in terms of looking at the underlying systems. Those are real issues, and it's something where, when I look at something like the Federal Reserve Supervisory Letter, I think it's 11.7, they talk about that concern, and you're seeing it pop up in other industries as well. So those are some of those governance issues, and so if we put it all together, what does that architecture look like? It looks a little bit like this, where you're blending together this governance layer along with some kind of data integration layer and some type of master data management, reference data management type layer, and that in and of itself is going to supply your analytics layer. Or if you want to put this more bluntly, you have a data infrastructure layer and then you have an analytics infrastructure layer that need to interact. So this concept of having a unified data infrastructure layer is really the goal, you could say, or maybe the objective or the rationale for Tibco Software's Unify line of products. The mission, I guess, is to unify data intelligently. And our big concern is how do we have that one place, and it doesn't have to be a physical one place, logical one place, or one layer of infrastructure that can support all of the transactional information, pull that data out, support all the master data, support all the reference data, and all the metadata, all the kinds of data. And, we've talked about thus far really analytics because it was a very easy to use example for 360. But, our other view is that this Unify layer doesn't just have to be about analytics. It can also be reused for operations and also for compliance. Because if we think about organizations really have, you could say, three main business process types, right? Run the business, understand the business, control the business. And the data architecture layer, the data infrastructure layer. You can call it data fabric layer if you want to, but that layer really should be able to support all three of those different contexts with the same technology, because the data that you're going to use to run the business, understand the business, control the business, really is agglomerated into these four types. So that's really what we have when we look at what we think is the minimally viable product set for this. Really having some type of master data management layer is really important. Having some kind of metadata layer where you're going to deal with the enterprise metadata management, the data governance, data catalog, and then some kind of data integration component, such as data virtualization, to bring that together. And when we look at customers who have done a very successful job in this, I would say Panera is a really good example. So Panera Bread is a U.S. quick-serve restaurant, and they purchased Tibco software a while back to build out what they call the Panera Data Pantry, very in line with their business. And that data pantry held information about their entire value chain. So in terms of cafes, where are they going to serve customers, in terms of products, what are they actually selling to their customers, and then supply chain information, materials, ingredients, and how those things are manufactured, the products, and distributed. This particular data layer supported their concept to market process as well. So when you talk about creating a new sandwich or a new salad or a new soup. So they built this robust architecture that holds all that information, and something happens. We have a pandemic. So because they had this infrastructure in place, they were able to quickly update their associates in terms of what restaurants will or will not be open. They were quickly able to update their websites. And that was simply because they're mastering all the location data. And then when it came around to doing things like pivoting, because we had to go from a world where we could go to restaurants now to a world where we can't, we have to pick up, we have to get delivery, what Panera was able to do is pivot very quickly into the grocery world by simply updating its item mix, updating its product mix. So you update it in one place, it propagates out to all of the web ordering systems, all of the point-of-sale systems, all of the delivery systems that maybe Uber Eats, Grubhub, Delivery would use. And that really came from this data backplane. And they were able to do that because the infrastructure was so robust. Move from ordering in the restaurant, sitting down, having a meal, moving from that to pick up and grocery in roughly 2 weeks. And if you think about the world before having this robust infrastructure, it would have taken a lot longer. So when I talked to the team over there and I asked them, well, how is it going? They said, it was tough because we had to get through a lot of other issues, but the data infrastructure, that was never a problem. And that's really what I think the benefit of having a robust infrastructure is. It's there, it works, and you don't have to worry about it. So if we move on to the last bit about Tibco before we go into Q&A, what I would like to say is that Tibco, long-standing name in the industry, we're, I guess, a well-known firm that's been deeply involved in enterprise infrastructure software, and the Unify is just, or the data management infrastructure that we sell, is just a portion of our product line. We have two other product lines. One is really much more focused on operations, which is the Connect line, where you have things like application integration, API management, and then Predict, which is really much more of our analytics infrastructure, analytics products. So that would include things such as visual analytics, data science, streaming analytics. And I think with that, Paul, do you have anything to add or any other comments that you'd want to pull through before we get into Q&A?
No, I think you nailed it. I particularly like, obviously, the Panera Bread proposition because it just added value around the agility. They've been able to change their business and survive in what is clearly very difficult circumstances. And they've been able to do that in part because the data is available and ready to use and integrate with third parties at a moment's choice.
Yeah, it's a good story. And I'm sure questions will come up, but I often think about this, and I don't want to take too much credit, because when I think about the operating model for organizations, it's there's many things, but if you just boil it down, it's about people, process, and systems. And usually the biggest asset of the firm are the people and the processes. The technology is what we do. I think it's critical. You need to have it, and it can certainly be used in the appropriate way to produce that robust infrastructure. And Panera's not the only customer we have this. It's like we have a lot of other customers that have done the same thing. But, I always think that technology is vital, but at the same time, the people and the processes really matter so much more. Because, good technology with no people and no process basically means no business.
Absolutely.
So anyways, maybe we should move into questions. And Molly, did you have anything to add, or should we just open it up? Was there some instructions that you need to provide?
Brilliant. So let's dive into some questions. And guys, we do have some time for questions, so make sure you send them on in. So let's go for the first one to come in. How long does this take to get to a stage where you get to see value to the business?
I think that's one of the reasons why I'm on the call, I suppose, is to answer those type of questions. Well, you could say it's as broad as it is long. What you can also say is that the data management aspects are typically part of an ongoing program. So there's you want to iterate through versions of your release schedule over time, and at each release you're looking for some kind of value back to the business. So the quickest I've seen it is 2 months. That was a very specific organization that managed to avoid the political issues that organizations can also bring to bear around programs. For the same type of concept that they delivered on in 2 months, I also know companies that have taken 6. So, because of the same issues around political landscape where they effectively are arguing between themselves around some definitions. And, this is a technology that helps itself or helps the organization at least realize the benefits over time. But, if there are competing parts of the organization, then we have to deal with that as well at a people level. It's not just around technology, as Conrad has already said. So we always target a 3-month cycle. So every 3 months, there's some additional business value being brought out of the application and the program that we're supporting, so that we can continue to add value to the business on an ongoing basis. And we see it more of a journey. There's not usually an end point, because once you finish with the first phase, which may be specific to a domain, like customer or product or supplier, you quickly get to address other domains within the business.
Yeah,
maybe that helps. Conrad?
Yeah, I was going to say. I think that's what I would have said. I would say it varies, right? And I think, Paul, to your point, politics really do play a pretty big role, right? The more contentious the problem you're trying to address, probably the longer it's going to take, because you have to wrangle herd all the cats, as they say. I would add a couple things as well. So if you go back to that idea of, the people, the process, and systems in your operating model, keep in mind that on the people side, learning curve is going to matter. Right? And so what I mean by that is, if your team is entirely new, everyone is new to this concept. Let's take the business governance, the data governance thing, for example, the business glossary bit. If everyone's totally new to the concept of managing those business terms in a systematic way, not only do you have to train people on how to do it and what kind of definitions you want. You don't want your schoolboy, definitions of, let's define the world. You really want the definitions that are appropriate or fit for business, right? So it's a little bit different there. We're not trying to solve that generic problem, really more specific problem. So you've got to train people on how to do it, and then you also have to sit down and write all the processes out. What do these processes look like? And then there has to be a recognition that there's iterative learning curves. You're going to take some time to learn how to do it. You're going to get to a point where things start to plateau, and then you may need to come back and revisit both the organizations as well as also review the process. And so one of the things that I often think about is, because you're dealing with a dynamic problem, not something where there's a beginning, middle, and end. It's not like a movie. Movies can play on forever. You need to worry about those different waves of learning curves, and then you have to think about the technology that you invest in and whether or not the technology is able to accommodate that dynamic process. If you have something that applies an overly rigid mindset or model to how you approach the problem, or provides a lot of pro forma processes that are inflexible, it might be suitable for the first phase where everyone's learning how to get things done, because nobody has a baseline to work from. But, it's like playing some sports, right? First I learned how to kick a soccer ball. I guess you guys don't call it soccer. But first I learned how to kick a soccer ball, then I learned how to dribble, and then, I learned how to pass. And then eventually I could start to play, the actual game. And it's when you get to that point where you can know how to play the actual game, when you know how to run your actual data governance platform, or run your master data management systems, or understand how to do data integration, when you start to put it all together, that's really where the flexibility starts to matter. So often what I caution people with is, you've got to look beyond the learning phase. You can't just assume that the technology is going to solve everything for you. It's not. And if you don't have individuals in the organization that are thinking beyond those first initial steps, you might choose something that's going to lock you in, I should say, in probably a much more, kind of immature level. It won't grow with you. So that's another comment I would make. I mean, Paul, you've seen that. We've seen that a lot, actually.
Yeah, we always use the phrases, think big, act small, because you need to iterate, but always with a view on where the end game is, and the end game may change through the process. So have something that's going to support that flexibility.
Yeah,
brilliant.
I was going to say that endgame might change. That is something, just one small comment. It's basically the data governance, the data management concept of model drift at play, really. But yeah. Molly, so do we have anything else?
So, we do have a couple other questions that have come in. So, for companies who are not mature in their data management and governance process, would you advise to lead with an MDM tool, or make sure more manual processes are written out and understood, or a bit of both?
I probably wouldn't start with MDM. I would probably start with metadata, mainly because the metadata allows you to understand where your data exists and the current processes that are being applied to it, and the language that people are currently using to describe it. That then may lead itself to a change in how that language evolves, but it's a good starting point to use as a single point of discussion within an organization around it, without actually affecting the data content right from the beginning. MDN is about putting a process in place to manage content for operational and analytical requirements and support governance. So that would come later. I would also advise that speak to people who've done it before. That is always a good use case. So that clearly there are many consultancy organizations out there. When I push people towards any particular one, I try to make sure that the parties are broad in their experience. They're not limited to one technology vendor, including ourselves. We want customers to have a broad view, because whatever's right for one customer could be different for another.
I agree with you, Paul. I think you certainly getting down to definitions is a good first step. But I do think, though, that you can balance the challenge. So if I understood the question properly, it was, well, do we want to start with master data? I'm not sure that's the best place to start. But then if you take a little bit further, it's like, should we write all the processes down and then start the process of implementing, or should we do a mixture of both? I actually think that you can learn how to do it. So, and this opinion is not widely shared. If you look at some of the analysts, some analysts would tell you, first you have to do application data management, or get all the data going into SAP cleaned up, get all the data going into Salesforce cleaned up, solve that data quality problem at the sources. Then they'll say, well, then you need to set up a customer hub. And then finally, once you do those types of things, or a customer hub, or a product hub, or supplier hub, and then after you do all those things, you can do MDM, right? I'm not sure if it needs to be so long. I would agree with that, Conrad. Yeah, if you go back to that comment about learning curve, if you think about starting with technology 1 to solve your Salesforce problem, then technology 2 to build a hub, and then you go to technology 3, which is master data, that's a lot to purchase, and that's also quite a bit for your team to ingest over a multi-year period. My viewpoint is a little bit more nuanced. What I would say is that you could pick off less politically contentious areas of the business and focus there. So if you go back to Paul's comment about about metadata, right? Does that mean you start in areas that are maybe more commonly held? So maybe the team can come together and say, look, we work in the healthcare industry. There's this healthcare data dictionary, healthcare business glossary. Let's just start there for common terms. Do we agree, right? Okay, not that politically contentious. So starting at an area where there's going to be a lot of common ground, You have to think about it almost like a geopolitical negotiation in some cases. Starting with some common ground is that first trust-building measure. So all the teams say, okay, yeah, we got a victory, right? We all agreed that we're going to use LOINC to describe labs, right? Or we're going to use HL7, or we're going to use FIBO or something like that if we're in financial services. So starting there is like really valuable. It kind of builds a momentum. And you do that next step, and you say, okay, well, now that we agree with the metadata and we're looking at the reference data, can we agree to one set of country codes? And people are going to say yes. Some people are going to say, no, we can't. And you dig into that. Why can't we? And then what does that mean? But if you start small, it's possible, I think, to acquire the right technology to support you in those early pursuits, to build the skills, to build the trust, and then eventually get to a point where you're doing things like managing custom data, supply data, blah, blah, blah. You've built out all the integrations. But it's an iterative process, to Paul's point. And then taking it also a little bit further, what I would say is scoping it to that 3-month cycle where you're delivering value every 3 months or there's a new production release. I think that's also pretty important because you also want to get people the sense that this project is moving forward, it's creating value in the organization, people are seeing benefits, and they're beginning to trust the data more and more. And you kind of do the build strength on strength, I guess is the best way to put it. Anything else, Paul, or what do you think?
No, that's good. Conscious that we've got 3.5 minutes left.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well,
So
let's jump into one last question then, as you pointed out, Paul. So we've got a question here that says, how modular can the solution be, i.e. organizations have a lot of existing functionality? Can complementary modules be integrated with existing technology and work in a similar way?
I would say yes.
So the answer broadly is yes, of course. Yeah. But it will depend on everybody's existing landscape on what value we'd be bringing to it and vice versa. So the short answer is yes. What we've talked about is capability that is required, all of it, for true data management. Obviously, Tibco believes it has all the components to be able to that. But our customers have existing infrastructure that we will also fit in with, some of which will be competitors, some of which will be open source. And we're a big supporter of the open source community. So in all instances, there is an opportunity to be modular, but we've described what we think is the whole problem today.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. I think if I were to make a plug for Tibco, what I would say is that we've taken great pains to make sure that all of our inter-system integrations are done through the public API, because we recognize that most organizations have a complex, tool chest of different kinds of applications, different kinds of technology that we're going to have to integrate with. And so if our public APIs aren't robust, we won't be able to support that. I would stress that, when I think about adoption, and at the end of the day, this is really about adopting a new mindset. And so it's a change management problem. It's actually not a technology problem. And I think people often forget that. They forget that, you need to change hearts and minds almost more than you need to change the underlying systems you use. So if you are dealing with that change management problem, compatibility with existing processes, compatibility with existing systems is a huge part of the problem, huge part of the puzzle. If the technology you require, and this is really why I go back to that concept of learning curve from a couple of responses ago, I said, look, if your organization's immature, sometimes looking and seeing applications that have a pre-built data model and having applications that have a pre-built governance process, having all those nice features is useful because you're starting with nothing. And it's like, oh, they got something, let's just go to that. And then you discover later that it kind of locks you into a particular mindset. Or it turns out that their process is incompatible with the way that your organization works. And then you have to throw it away, or you have to bend the application around the axle to get it to work for you. My view is that you need to really think hard when you're looking at both solutions as well as consulting firms as well as partners. Does it work with the way we do things? Because at the end of the day, the uniqueness of organizations is tied to the people in the process. And technology should be there in service of that, rather than forcing you to behave a certain way because, well, that's the way it was written in the application. I mean, sometimes I joke, do you really want to trust your vendor with some of these decisions? You should really trust yourself. I guess that's the end, right? I don't think we don't really have time for any more questions. But I guess you can send your questions in, and we'll forward them on to us. We'll email you directly. Go on. Sorry, Mon.
That's okay. I was going to say that is all we have time for today. Thank you both so much. And those questions that we didn't quite get time to answer, I will pass over to you so you can answer them over email for us. And do remember, everyone, you can connect with both Paul and Conrad on LinkedIn. You should be able to see their LinkedIns on your screen now.